The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound echo in your ears. Sheriff Joe Turner pulled into the gravel lot of the Golden Sands Motel. His headlights caught a familiar car, a silver sedan parked under a flickering neon sign. It was Maria's car, his wife's car. Joe stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked closer. His heart pounded harder with every step. Through the thin, faded curtains of room 6, he saw shadows moving. 2 figures, a man, a woman. From inside, muffled voices reached him. A laugh, a low murmur, and then silence. Joe's chest tightened. He pushed the door open, and it slammed against the wall. Inside, the room was a mess of cheap furniture and bad decisions. On the bed sat Maria, her face pale, her eyes wide with guilt. Beside her stood Marcus, a young man barely old enough to rent the room. He froze, his shirt half-buttoned, his hands trembling. Joe's voice broke the silence, sharp and demanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. She stood, her hands raised as if to calm him. "Joe, it's not what you think." And just like that, Sheriff Joe Turner's world came crashing down. What led Maria here? And who was this young man caught in the middle of it all? Stick around as we unravel the tangled web of betrayal, secrets, and consequences. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank all my subscribers for your incredible support. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get back to it, because this is only the beginning. Joe Turner was the kind of man people looked up to. As the sheriff of a small, close-knit town, he wore his badge with pride and took his oath seriously. He believed in protecting his community, standing for justice, and doing what was right. And back home, he had Maria, a loving wife who had stood by his side for over a decade. On the outside, their life seemed perfect. A cozy home on a quiet street, laughter shared over weekend dinners, and the kind of love that everyone thought was unshakable. But life isn't always what it looks like, is it? Maria loved Joe, but being married to a sheriff wasn't easy. The long nights, the constant calls, the emergencies that pulled him away without warning. It all left Maria sitting alone more often than not. While Joe was chasing criminals and keeping the town safe, Maria was chasing something she couldn't quite name. Loneliness has a way of sneaking in. It starts as a whisper, a quiet ache, but over time, it grows louder until it's all you can hear. Maria began to feel invisible, like a shadow in her own home. And then, one night, everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and Maria decided to attend the college basketball game. Joe was out of town on yet another work assignment, and Maria figured the noise and the crowd might drown out the silence she felt inside. That's when she saw him. Marcus Daniels, a star player on the college basketball team. Young, confident, and full of energy, Marcus had a way of commanding attention on the court. Maria couldn't take her eyes off him. Every move he made, every basket he scored, it all pulled her in. After the game, their paths crossed in the parking lot. He was struggling to fit a duffel bag into his beat-up old car, and Maria, feeling bold, or maybe just desperate, offered to help. What started as a casual conversation turned into something more. But why Marcus? Why would a woman like Maria, with a life so seemingly perfect, be drawn to a college kid barely making ends meet? Was it his charm? His talent? Or was it something deeper? What happens when love turns to isolation? What drives a person to step outside the boundaries they once swore to honor? Maria and Marcus's meeting was no accident. It was the start of a story that would unravel everything Joe thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and himself. Stay with me, because the twists and turns of this story will leave you questioning everything. Maria never asked for much. When she married Joe, she knew his job would keep him away sometimes. But it was all part of the deal, right? After all, she loved him. She knew the sacrifices, and in the beginning, it felt worth it. In the early years of their marriage, things were perfect. Joe would come home after long shifts, tired but happy, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. They would share their dreams, laugh at stupid jokes, and plan for a future they thought would always be together. But over time, the talks became shorter, the laughter less frequent. Joe's job grew more demanding. There were more late-night calls, more weekends spent away. Maria was left alone, surrounded by the silence of a house that once felt warm and full of love. Her friends would tell her how lucky she was. A sheriff's wife, living in a house like this, with the man who keeps the town safe. But what they didn't see was the loneliness creeping in, like a shadow that grew longer with every passing day. Maria began to feel invisible. She tried to fill the emptiness with errands, hobbies, and social gatherings, but nothing worked. She would sit on the couch at night, staring at the clock, waiting for a call from Joe. It never came. And when it did, it was brief, a promise of another long night away. The silence in the house grew louder. The loneliness became heavier. And then there was Marcus. He didn't make her feel invisible. When Maria saw him on the basketball court, something in her stirred. It was more than just his good looks or the way he moved on the court. It was the energy, the life in him. He seemed so alive, so full of possibilities. Maria tried to push away the thoughts. She was married. She had a good man. But the ache inside her wouldn't go away. And when she met Marcus after the game, she felt something shift, something she hadn't felt in years. Her mind told her to stop, to walk away. But her heart, her aching heart, didn't listen. Was it loneliness that drove her to Marcus? Was it the emptiness of a marriage left to wither while Joe worked long hours? Or was it something deeper, a need for attention, for affection, for a reminder that she was still seen, still wanted? But as much as you might feel sympathy for Maria's pain, you can't ignore the question. Was her loneliness an excuse or a warning sign? Maria found herself standing at the edge, and she didn't know which way to fall. The line between what was right and wrong started to blur, and every decision she made seemed like it would either fix everything or ruin it forever. What would you have done? Would you have stayed in that silence, waiting for someone to notice? Or would you have crossed that line too? Stay with me. This is only getting started. Maria's heart was racing. Her thoughts scattered every time she saw Marcus play. Something about the way he moved on that basketball court, it was like he had a fire in him that she hadn't seen in years. Each game, each moment, she couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't just his skill. It was the way he made her feel alive again. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, Maria found herself drawn to him, her thoughts slipping away from Joe. At first, it was harmless, just a glance here, a smile there. But the more she watched him, the deeper her feelings grew. He was everything her life with Joe wasn't anymore. Young, full of energy, with a future that seemed wide open. Maria wasn't blind. She knew Marcus had his struggles. After the game, she overheard him talking to his friends about how hard it was to pay for tuition and help his mom back home. He had dreams, big ones, of making it out of the small town and getting a scholarship that could change everything. but it felt like he was fighting a battle he might not win. Maria saw an opportunity. She could help him. She could offer him money to help pay for his college, his family, whatever he needed. But there was one condition. He would have to spend time with her, to talk to her, to give her the attention she so desperately craved. But quickly, it became more than just casual chats. Maria was paying Marcus, and he was giving her something in return: companionship, affection, and a distraction from the loneliness that consumed her. She never expected it to go this far. It wasn't love, not really. It was a transaction, but somewhere along the way, she let her heart get involved. Marcus didn't mind. He had his reasons. His family needed him. He couldn't afford to let pride stand in his way. And Maria, well, she had money. Lots of it. In exchange for companionship, for being seen, for being wanted. He could take care of his family and his dreams. He convinced himself it was a win-win. But as he spent more time with Maria, something started to change. He liked being with her, enjoyed the attention. He found himself caught in a situation he didn't quite know how to get out of. It wasn't all about money, not anymore. Meanwhile, Joe, he was blind to it all. He had his hands full with his job. The town needed him, and that meant long hours, late nights, and days spent away from home. He was a sheriff, dedicated, committed, and hardworking. He loved Maria, but how could he see the cracks forming in their marriage when he was always out there, doing his job? He couldn't. He didn't know what was happening when he wasn't home. But even Joe wasn't completely oblivious. Something was off. He could feel it in his gut. Maria's distance, her late nights, her strange moods. He began to wonder if she was hiding something from him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. He tried to dismiss it, focusing on his work, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he felt the weight of something wrong. In a town like this, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Joe's suspicions were growing, slowly building, until one day, they would be too much to ignore. But by then, Maria was already tangled in a web of choices she couldn't take back. What happens when two people, caught in their own struggles, start making decisions that blur the lines of right and wrong? What happens when the things they want, the things they crave, start to cost them more than they could ever imagine? Maria thought she could handle it. She thought she could keep the secret. But secrets have a way of getting out, and when they do, they destroy everything. Stay with me. This story is just beginning. Joe had been noticing the changes in Maria for weeks. She was distant, cold. Her eyes, once filled with love, now seemed empty. She would smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She would cook dinner, but her mind was elsewhere. She was always busy, always distracted. And when Joe came home after a long shift, she wasn't waiting for him like she used to. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. One night, after a long day at the office, Joe decided to follow her. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he needed to know. Maria's late-night excuse about a girls' night out didn't sit right with him anymore. So, he got in his truck and drove. The flickering neon sign of the motel was the first thing he saw when he pulled up. The King's Lodge, a dump of a place. It wasn't even on his radar before, but tonight it seemed like the only thing that mattered. Joe parked his truck a few spaces down and waited. The smell of stale air and cheap cologne hung heavy in the air. He could almost taste it. Joe's boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud as he walked toward the motel's entrance. Each step felt like it echoed in the quiet night, loud enough for anyone to hear. He was careful, moving slow, but he couldn't ignore the rage building inside him. He had to know. The steps up to the second-floor rooms creaked under his weight. The air grew thicker, heavier with every step. There was no turning back now. His heart raced in his chest as he reached the door of room 207. Through the cracked curtains, Joe saw shadows moving inside. The low hum of a television. Soft voices. His stomach twisted. He didn't need to see more. He knew. With a deep breath, he swung the door open without knocking, his fists clenched at his sides. The door slammed against the wall, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The room smelled faintly of perfume and cheap cologne. The bed was a mess, sheets tangled, pillows askew, and there, on the edge of the bed, was Maria. Maria, with Marcus. They both froze. Maria's eyes widened, her face draining of color. The tears welled up instantly, her mouth opening as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Marcus, on the other hand, looked terrified. He scrambled to stand up, pulling his shirt down quickly, but his fear was clear. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling. He was caught. No escaping it now. The tension in the room was suffocating. Joe stood there, staring at the woman he loved and the young man who had taken everything from him. His heart felt like it was being ripped out. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of him. His marriage, his trust, shattered in an instant. Maria's voice broke through the silence. "It's not what you think, Joe. Please. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." Joe's voice was low, strained. "How long, Maria? How long have you been lying to me?" His words cut through her like a knife, and the tears started to flow freely from her eyes. She looked broken, but so did Joe. Marcus stood frozen, still too afraid to speak. Joe could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was caught, that everything he had done for the money, the attention, was now worthless. Maria tried to reach out to Joe, her voice shaking. "Joe, I didn't know what to do. I was so lonely, and you were always gone. I never meant to hurt you. Joe held up his hand, silencing her. Don't say anything else." His voice cracked with anger, disbelief, and pain all mixed together. Every word she spoke felt like a betrayal, a dagger to his chest. He could feel the weight of her lies pressing down on him. The room was quiet except for the sound of Maria's sobs, the heavy breath of Marcus, and Joe's footsteps as he turned and walked back to the door. His heart was torn between anger and heartbreak, but the one thing he knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. Joe didn't look back as he left the room. He didn't have to. The sight of Maria and Marcus would haunt him forever. This was it. His marriage was over. And it all started with a secret, one that no one had seen coming. Maria had been lying to Joe for months. Every penny of the money he'd saved for their future, she'd been giving to Marcus. It was money meant for their dreams, their plans. Money that was now fueling a secret betrayal. At first, Marcus didn't want any part of it. He felt guilty, like he was using her. But Maria, she didn't give him a choice. She'd say things like, "You need this more than I do," or "What's a few thousand when we could be together?" She made him believe she was the answer to his problems. Marcus tried to pull away. He did. He told her that it had to end, that the money, the nights, everything, it was wrong. But Maria wasn't done. She wasn't ready to give up. She promised him that without her, he'd lose everything. His chance to make it big, to have the life he dreamed about. And then she would cry. Tears, soft whispers of love, and it was all too much for Marcus to resist. She knew exactly how to twist his heart to make him feel like he couldn't walk away, no matter how hard he tried. But then something unexpected happened. That night in the motel, everything changed. Just as Joe's anger boiled over, a neighbor, just a few rooms down, overheard the argument. The shouting, the pain, it was too much to ignore. They called the police. In an instant, everything spiraled out of control. The situation that had been simmering for months, the secrets and lies, they were now in the open. The door to the motel room slammed open again, and this time, it wasn't just Joe. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. And as Maria looked at Marcus, their eyes locking in silent terror, she knew it was too late to stop what was coming. Maria's heart raced as the sound of sirens filled the air. She could hear them now, getting closer and closer. But could she escape the mess she'd made? Or was this just the beginning of the end? Sheriff Joe Turner stood in his office, staring out the window. The same window he'd looked through hundreds of times, watching his town, his life, slip through his fingers. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from anger. Anger at himself, at Maria, at Marcus. He had spent years building a life with Maria, trusting her with everything. Now, all he could do was ask, why? But Joe wasn't just the heartbroken husband. He was the sheriff. And as much as his heart screamed for answers, his mind, his duty as a lawman, couldn't let him forget the bigger picture. He had a job to do. So he sat across from Marcus, watching the young man shift uncomfortably under the weight of his guilt. The room felt cold. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as Joe flipped through the notes. "Tell me about the money," Joe asked, his voice low but firm. Marcus hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door like he was looking for an escape that wasn't there. She paid me, Sheriff. For my time," Marcus muttered, his voice barely a whisper. She wanted someone to listen. I needed the money. I didn't know what I was getting into." Joe's jaw tightened. "And you never thought about walking away?" "She said she needed me," Marcus replied, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how to stop. I was desperate." Joe closed his eyes, his stomach turning. His wife, the woman he trusted most, had used him, used his love for her to feed her own loneliness. And now, a young man, hungry for success, had become her pawn. Joe knew he had to get to the bottom of this. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, that something darker was hiding beneath the surface. Then came the expert commentary. A forensic psychologist from the local department had been called in to examine Maria's behavior. "This is a textbook case of emotional manipulation and power dynamics," she said, her tone clinical. Maria preyed on Marcus's vulnerability. She made him feel like he needed her, that he couldn't survive without her help. It's clear that she used sex and money as tools to control him. Joe couldn't stop thinking about those words. Was this a cry for help, or something darker? Was Maria really just looking for companionship, or was there more to this than just loneliness? He looked down at his desk, seeing the photo of Maria smiling at him on their wedding day. That smile, so full of promise. And now, that same woman had betrayed him, manipulated a young man, and lied to everyone. Joe couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The woman he loved was no longer the woman he thought he knew. But as the investigation continued, Joe would discover something that would shatter everything he thought was true about his marriage. Something that would change the course of their lives forever. The door slams shut behind Joe, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he steps into the house. The smell of the familiar, the scent of dinner once cooked with love, now feels like a distant memory. Joe's eyes lock on Maria. She's sitting at the kitchen table, her face red from crying, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. 1,000 thoughts race through his mind, but no words come out. Why, Maria? How long has this been going on? How could you do this to me? To us? I was lonely, Joe. I was so alone. You were never here. Always gone. Always working. I needed someone. I needed him. She was saying it, and yet he couldn't believe it. All those late nights, those quiet dinners he ate alone. Was she blaming him for what had happened? So, you thought paying a kid to fill the empty space in our bed was the answer? Him? A college kid barely scraping by? What kind of person, what kind of wife, does that? I didn't know what else to do, Joe. You were always gone. And when I saw him, when I saw how much he cared, it was like I finally mattered to someone. I felt something again. Joe stood there, his mind spinning. Betrayal, anger, but deep down, a bitter, twisted realization began to creep in. Was it all his fault? Could he have been a better husband, more present, more in tune with Maria's pain? Is that what you think? That I wasn't there for you? That I failed you? What about us, Maria? What about the years we built together? Was I just another thing for you to throw away when you got bored? And there it was, the question he had been avoiding, the one that he knew would come eventually. Was Marcus just another victim in this twisted story, or was he just as guilty as Maria? Should Joe arrest him for exploiting her loneliness, or was Maria's role just as dark, using him, manipulating him to feel wanted, to fill a void she couldn't face on her own? The room was thick with tension, with pain. Neither of them had the answer. The truth was too ugly, too tangled to untangle in that moment. And so they stood there, two people lost, two people who had hurt each other, both with their own kind of guilt. Joe had spent years protecting this town, protecting the people he loved. But now, in the shadow of betrayal, who was the real victim? And who was the real villain? Was it Maria, who had sought affection and comfort in the wrong place? Or was it Marcus, the college kid just trying to survive? Or was it Joe, lost in his own guilt, caught between the weight of his duty and the pain of his heart? The answers wouldn't come easy, and they still wouldn't come for a long time. In the wake of the scandal, everything changed. Joe, broken and betrayed, filed for divorce. His once quiet life as a sheriff, proud of his family, crumbled in front of him. His heart ached every time he thought about Maria, his wife, the woman he thought he knew. The trust was gone, and so was the love. Maria, once respected in the community, now found herself shunned. Friends turned their backs. Whispers followed her wherever she went. The pain of knowing she'd lost everything, her marriage, her dignity, was too much to bear. Her mistakes hung over her like a storm cloud that never left. And then there was Marcus, a young man with dreams of playing basketball at the college level, who thought this opportunity might change his life. But instead, it ended in shame. He transferred to another school, leaving behind not only his dreams of the game, but also the tangled web he'd gotten caught in. Marcus, too, was left to pick up the pieces of a broken past. In a small town like this, secrets don't stay hidden for long. The scandal shook the very foundation of this quiet community. It tore apart families, friendships, and reputations. Trust was shattered, and no one emerged unscathed. A painful reminder that sometimes the smallest towns hold the biggest secrets and the deepest wounds. And so, this story of betrayal, guilt, and broken hearts came to an end, but the scars left behind will last much longer. As we look back on this story, we can't help but ask, was Maria simply a victim of loneliness, trapped in a marriage that lacked the connection she craved? Or did she take advantage of Marcus's vulnerability, using him as a way to fill the emptiness inside her? And what about Joe? Could he have saved his marriage if he had been there more, if he had paid more attention to the cracks slowly forming around him? These are questions that leave us wondering about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. Trust, once broken, is so hard to rebuild. Betrayal, like a shadow, looms over everything, leaving us questioning who the real victim is. In the end, we all seek connection, but sometimes the ways we go about it can lead us down dark paths. Next time, we'll dive into another story, a tale of passion, power, and the price of betrayal. Another chapter where love and trust are tested, and where the consequences of deceit are impossible to ignore. What would you do in their place? Tune in for a story that will leave you questioning everything. Until then, take care and remember, truth always finds a way to come to light.